Hey all, apologies to anyone who was following this channel for a while when I stopped using it and focused a little bit more on the pure audio podcast side of things. It really just comes down to being a hobbyist and not a professional and not really having the most time to do some of these things. That's not really being my area of expertise. But now that we're getting a little bit more into the season, I wanted to try to at least make sure to post some of my updated rankings on this channel for 2025. Every year I do a ranking after week 5 of the college football season. At least I've done this for the 2023, 2024, and now the 2025 classes. I also reviewed this on the show previously. But right now I'm just going to cut in a clip from the Fantasy for Real podcast. The first one today will be the quarterback and tight end rankings put together. And if you like what you hear, the rest of the rankings, including the running backs, will be available on that same podcast, as well as the wide receivers were available on the next podcast. These will be released on the YouTube channel shortly, but I do have to put the videos together, so give me a little bit of time there. But as always, if you want to follow the most recent updates for the show, the best places to do that are on the Substack, cjfreel.substack.com, and following the podcast on either Spotify or Apple Podcast with the handle Fantasy for Real. So anyway, with all that said, I will get into my rankings for the 2025 quarterback class, as well as the 2025 tight end class, so far in the 2024 season. There are a few notes that are specific to the quarterback position in terms of the way we like to see players develop in a standard curve. You know, maybe they get a little bit of time in their freshman year, but primarily they become the starter their second year. They start 2 full seasons at the collegiate level, and especially by that second year, they're playing elite football. We don't get that all the time, obviously, but that is what I would probably consider the most prototypical. And then at quarterback for our game in particular, it is important to distinguish between a pocket passer, someone who's a little bit more of a scrambler. Maybe they'll get some rushing yards, but mostly create with their arm. And then someone who is an outright rushing quarterback, someone who will be used as a primary rusher by their team. These different archetypes obviously have very different upsides for our game. They might all end up being very good quarterbacks. I mean, look at how CJ Stroud was valued, especially this offseason, and I think his value is still roughly where it was. But in general, if you had to pick between the three, you would want someone who runs a little bit because that is where the fantasy upside is the most. Now, I already mentioned bad rules in college football rushing stats, but I just want to reiterate, no sacks will be in our college football rushing stats. And so just to get to this class itself, I think the most important thing for this class is that there really isn't any tier 1 quarterbacks yet. Now, we're coming off the heels of the Georgia-Alabama game. This is the very first time we're going to talk about the Georgia-Alabama game on this show. And Jalen Milroe played like a tier 1 quarterback, a true tier 1 quarterback at the NFL level, and did things that, frankly, just based on last year, I would not have thought he would be capable of doing this year. On that basis alone, maybe we shouldn't be still saying that there's no tier 1 quarterbacks, and I'll get into some of the candidates in a second here. But my confidence level is not quite high enough yet. So as I was designing these rankings for the quarterbacks, I did something a little differently than I've done the first 2 years. Because the last 2 years were the first 2 years that I did a ranking at this period of time. And in both those classes, we had a clear anchor. Now, Drake May ended up going 3rd overall, not 2nd overall, but still, he was pretty much an anchor to that quarterback class, constantly ranked very highly. And we had Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, and then Drake May and Caleb Williams. So between having those 2 anchors in each class, it both made the quarterback 3 conversation the main one, and it kind of didn't feel weird to go back and forth with who your quarterback 3 was. And then it also kind of gave us the ability to kind of be patient with players rising up into the first round. We didn't have to make the case that this guy was going to be the first overall pick or that this guy was going to be a first round pick because it didn't feel like we needed that quite as much. But in a class like this, especially when all of the media mock drafts that had Beck in the top 5 are gonna get blown up, and we'll get to Beck in a bit. I don't think it's all doom and gloom, but Beck is going to go from very, very overrated because we did have him at the quarterback 1 in like May, but not in like the 2nd or 3rd week of the season, and never in the top 5 or 10 in the NFL draft. But Beck is going to go from very overrated to very underrated very quickly, especially if people just think he's like very, very bad at this point. But specifically because he's been in that top 5 grading from all these NFL mock drafts, that's going to really create a vacuum once more for a number 1 quarterback. And so we're going to see a lot of talk about Jalen Milroe going in the number 1 pick. And he very well might. But I still don't have enough confidence yet in this class. I'll be watching back the Milroe tape later today. We'll see how I feel about it after that. But I don't have enough confidence yet in this class to really feel like there is a true tier 1 quarterback. So my plan going into the week was to kind of combine tiers 1 and 2 and then split up tiers 1 and 2 by an A, a B, and a C, where A, B, and C are separated by the amount of upside. I think this is the right way to do it because as much as a quarterback, and we'll use Carson Beck because he's the easy one to use after having a bad last weekend, with a quarterback like Carson Beck, it is easy to say, well, he might get drafted higher, but as a fantasy asset, especially because he's not going to add much with his legs on the ground, would you take the shot at one of the higher upside fantasy assets, even if you might miss out on a guy who's slightly more likely to get drafted still? And so because of that, right now, I do think the targets on this class, if you were playing in Devy, if you were valuing them Devy, I would target the higher upside players most likely because those are the ones that are more likely to get excited top 10 picks. Now, originally I was going to start off by talking about Cam Ward as the main upside guy. And Cam Ward, if we're just ranking 1 to, I think I have 11 on this list today. And if we're just ranking 1 to 11, Cam Ward and Jalen Milroe are tied for 1. So I still see a lot of upside with Cam Ward. But Jalen Milroe is always going to be in his own tier, and after the game against Georgia, we're going to put him in the A so that the tiers are very clearly the A tier is the most upside for fantasy, the B tier is the exciting breakout tier, and the C tier is the tier of quarterbacks who are, the only word I've been able to find for my list so far is just good. Especially because I don't want to use something that kind of reduces them, because boring is the more accurate word to really describe the way I feel about it. And you can be a very good quarterback and be boring, but I don't think they are good enough at the college level to justify going very highly as boring quarterbacks. So it's kind of like not good enough and boring is like a kind of very reductionist tier name. But anyway, to jump into the players themselves, so Jalen Milroe in the A tier for the high upside play that he brings to the table. Jalen Milroe is 6'2", 225 pounds, and while he is athletically superior to most of the players in this class, it is important to note that the kind of Anthony Richardson comparisons are probably not fair because Anthony Richardson had a very mediocre year in his third year of college and still went 4th overall. Jalen Milroe was eligible for the NFL draft last year and came back to college. And as good as the quarterback class was last year, you have to imagine if he was perceived like an Anthony Richardson, he would no longer be in college. So he is a 4th-year player, a senior, but the elite performance against Georgia has really put him on the map. It's important to note that, when it comes to like a comparison between Jalen Milroe and Jaden Daniels had never made very high difficulty throws. It was very much outside of his game. And the main difference that we saw in the final year, a difference that we also saw on Monday Night Football not that long ago, was that he developed in the ability to finally hit those downfield passes. This has never, ever been an issue with Jalen Milroe. This is a very different thing between the two of them. Jalen Milroe has always been good at the higher difficulty passes, or at least last year he had a very healthy big-time throw percentage. In fact, when you consider that his overall number of attempts is a little bit lower because of his style of play, his big-time throw percentage was one of the highest in the sport. What Milroe has had the higher difficulty doing is kind of all the other stuff that comes with being a quarterback outside of just throwing a deep ball and running if you can't throw the deep ball. Because that was such a simple A and B for Jalen Milroe's profile, I really didn't have a lot of confidence in him turning it around after a couple years at Alabama. But it's not just the fact that he played so well against Georgia, it is the fact that there are certain games that a player plays where you say to yourself, okay, well, I'm sure they didn't do this thing well. And then you look at it and it's like, oh, no, they did that thing really well. And then you go, oh, well, I'm sure they didn't do, no, that one's great too. And everything across the board with what Jalen Milroe did against the Georgia Bulldogs was phenomenal. Jalen Milroe was not even credited with a turnover-worthy play by PFF for his interception. He continued to pile on the big-time throws, which is, again, something that he has always done. But the phenomenal part to me is that one of the things that scared me the most in Jalen Milroe's game was the fact that last year, Milroe had a 3.44 second time to throw, which is really, really high. So we'll get to a quarterback later in the show who's basically like next to last in FBS this year, and he's at like 3.15. So 3.45 second time to throw is like really, really bad. And maybe there's just something to the system itself, but Jalen Milroe's time to throw in this game was 2.56, which is a very, very healthy time for a mobile quarterback like Jalen Milroe. While sometimes Jalen Milroe has smaller samples, this was 37 dropbacks because, again, this was a game that went into very high scoring, went back and forth for, not back and forth. It went back and forth once after Alabama scored about 30 points, and then Georgia came back and took a lead, and then Alabama won. But 2.56, like, that's not something he even did once last season. His best time to throw in a single game was 2.86. Jalen Milroe only had 3 games last year under 3-second time to throw. Jalen Milroe had 4 games last year over 3.5 and 2 games last year over 4 seconds. So he is getting the ball out this year, and it wasn't just this game. I'm just only focused on this game because this game blew me away. But Jalen Milroe is getting the ball out quicker than I thought he was capable of after last year. And to say capable, like, it sounds wrong, but when a player is so bad in a specific area, usually when they get better at football, they don't get extremely better in that area. They turn around in other areas, and then they just kind of improve their negatives slightly to the point where they're not really detriments. I'm not trying to suggest after one game at Georgia that Jalen Milroe can now read out a field better than anybody in college football, and 2.56 is not like the quickest time to throw we've ever seen. Not that the quickest time to throw is always the most ideal, but it showcases growth and improvement for a guy who's still a young quarterback, especially by quarterback standards. You know, he's not going to be 23 years old by his draft age, by his September 1st age. And so seeing this kind of progression is just a massive thing. And I'll add one more specific area. As a coach, you can create with the short and behind the line passes, right? Like, say all you will about Jayden Daniels having a spectacular game, and I think Jayden Daniels did have a spectacular game on Monday Night Football, and I hope this past weekend I'm recording before the game. But I think it's also fair to say when you see this Washington offense, when they're throwing so many things behind the line of scrimmage, so many things short, those are things that Jayden Daniels doesn't have to work too hard to do. And Jayden Daniels has his rushing and the deep ball. But in the intermediate area of the field, from 10 to 19 yards of depth, Jalen Milroe was 6 of 9 for 89 yards. And in the middle of the field, like in the 10 to 19 range, between the hashes, he was 4 of 5 for 58 yards. So I'll have to look out for those plays when I rewatch the game specifically and kind of see if there's anything just too trickery in the game plan that kind of lessens how impressed I am by that. But as of right now, I am extremely impressed with Jalen Milroe's game because he has kept everything that has made him explosive in the past, his rushing and big playability with his arm. But he has seemingly added the ability to process at least this Kalen DeBoer system a little bit better than we thought probably possible based on last year. So maybe it is a system catered to Jalen Milroe, but that doesn't necessarily fully matter because if someone can see the way that you can cater a system to make this guy into an elite quarterback, that is something that they might try to do and take him again as high as the number 1 overall pick. So like I said, there's no real distinct difference between the first 3 tiers in terms of grading necessarily at this point because my overall confidence is too low to give really good grades out. But I am moving off from the single tier of Jalen Milroe in 1 to 2A and moving on to 1 to 2B, which is kind of the players who show more breakout signs and fantasy upside signs to me compared to the players that are going to come up a little bit later in 1 to 2C. So the first player here, and the player that I would tie with Jalen Milroe right now as the Devy asset that I would probably want the most in fantasy leagues, is Cam Ward, the quarterback from Miami. And this should have been in the general notes. I might say this a few times, but I apologize if I forget to say school names. I try to say school names. Sometimes I forget because I'm really focused on kind of the analytical side of things, and so I'm kind of past the school sometimes, and I didn't write it down on my notes, but Cam Ward, quarterback from Miami of Florida, spent his first 2 years at Incarnate Word University, which is an FCS program, then spent his next 2 years at Washington State, which used to be obviously in the Pac-12. I guess it is still kind of in the Pac, but let's not get into that. So while Jalen Milroe is the most like maybe Jayden Daniels from a upside perspective, from an explosive rushing perspective, when it comes to career arcs, trajectories, when it comes to development, I think actually Cam Ward is the most Jayden Daniels-y breakout of this cycle. So what I mean by that are a couple things. First off, they were both fifth-year players that were also fifth-year starters. Usually when we say fifth-year player, we don't mean fifth-year starter. But these players both played in 2020, which was a year canceled out by COVID-19, which means neither one lost a season for playing in 2020. They were also both players who deserved to get that season back. Like, not to say that I would take it away from any other players, but obviously there were certain players who played like pretty much an entire 2020 season and then got another year of eligibility. Cam Ward was in an FCS league that completely canceled their season and then played a short season in spring, and the Pac handled COVID probably worse than anybody else, especially when it comes down to how many games got played. So Jayden Daniels and Cam Ward were both starters for their team in the year 2020, but neither one played much in that year because of COVID-19 itself. Cam Ward then gets a pretty big profile coming into Washington State. He was actually probably my quarterback 4 going into that year because he was eligible in the 2022 draft class. But from the very beginning with Cam Ward, I said he is not a quarterback I love. He is a quarterback that I want to love. And he was pretty disappointing in that 2022 year because I do focus on the big time throw stat. And Cam Ward only had 10 big time throws the entire year. Part of that was the air raid system that they were running, which had a lot of short passes. But it was still a number that was extremely disappointing for Cam Ward. But that leads us to our key progression, our key stat. I'm not going to have like a key stat for every player, but Cam Ward absolutely deserves to have a key stat because it is his big time throw progression through 3 years. So in 2022, his big time throw percentage was under 2%. In 2023, it was under 5%. So under 5% is a little bit of an improvement, but still not quite where you want to see it for an NFL prospect. But so far in 2024, Cam Ward's big time throw percentage is over 10%. So that over 10% big time throw percentage is just spectacular. And his turnover worthy play percentage is at a career low. Now, there were big time issues in the Virginia Tech game. And if you haven't seen the Virginia Tech game, that is kind of the full Cam Ward experience. The first fumble in that game is completely inexcusable. It is Will Levisian. I don't know if that translated well, but basically it reminded me directly of Will Levis when he is falling down from a sack and for some reason at the last moment, instead of just taking the sack, decides that he's going to make something crazy happen when he's almost prone on the ground. And his arm flails out and the ball becomes a fumble and the other team gets great field position in a game where you're an 18-point favorite. When you are an 18-point favorite, those are the mistakes you cannot make. In this offseason, I said something about Cam Ward to Ohio State and how if I was Ohio State, Cam Ward would almost worry me because while Cam Ward has this amazing ability to extend plays and create, for a team like Ohio State, which is so loaded at wide receiver and running back, he is also the kind of quarterback that I would be worried about losing me a game against a team I should win. And for most of this season so far, I have mostly regretted saying that because this Ohio State team with Cam Ward looks like a team that would never, ever lose a college football game. But this Virginia Tech game was a little bit of what I meant by that, where we saw the fumble early on in the first drive, and then to his credit, to his defense, whatever you want to call it, on the previous play, Cam Ward throws a touchdown. But after a touchdown is called back, when they're still trailing Virginia Tech at this point because of the short field, because of a little sloppiness on defense, they're trailing Virginia Tech, they get a touchdown called back, and then on the very next play, Cam Ward throws a red zone pick. And it was a really bad red zone pick. It was just a case of Cam Ward locking in on something. The route didn't cause the defender to bite at all. It's one of these cases where the commentary is giving the defender a lot of credit. And yes, he should get credit. I mean, he made an interception, but he didn't really do anything except for on a 3rd and long play, not sprint to the line of scrimmage on a small move. So other than that, he really didn't do anything all that impressive. So Cam Ward throws an awful red zone pick. Even the second pick, I can get over. You probably want to hold that ball. but that's an acceptable turnover to me. I'm never going to be too upset when a ball is like a foot away from getting into a contested catch situation with my guy. And because of the ball placement combined with where the receiver turned around, the placement's just not great. But the fumble on the first drive and the red zone pick are just two of those mistakes that are in the category of like, this needs to happen almost 0 times a game for your entire career. This is not like a one time a game kind of a mistake. Like you can make one turnover worthy play a game, but turnover worthy plays are not equal. You cannot make one of these kind of mistakes a game, and Cam Ward made 2 against Virginia Tech. But what Cam Ward also did against Virginia Tech, going back to that original key stat, is I think PFF might have given him 6 or 7 big time throws. When I was live counting in the game and I wasn't paying as close of attention as someone probably getting paid to actually, chart that game, and I didn't chart the game myself, I was just watching it. But I only had like 4, but I also didn't give him a big time throw for the play that's amazing where he breaks through 2 sacks. Again, if you haven't seen it, I would look through a highlight play of Cam Ward against Virginia Tech. But they gave him a big time throw for breaking through 2 sacks and shoveling it off to a runner who then breaks a tackle and makes a 20-yard gain up the sideline. But the point is that like he didn't even grade poorly despite having 3 turnovers, despite having 3 turnover-worthy plays, because he had, I think, 6 or 7 big time throws. And that is something that has never been in Cam Ward before. Even the fact, and like we don't want to get too much into quarterback wins in this segment, but even the fact that he came back and won the game is a significant thing that we have to take into consideration. When you compare that to last year's Cam Ward, when he was up against Wisconsin in the second week of the season, that game he just lost. And it wasn't as bad as some of the games I'm about to talk about, but if you want to really see Cam Ward fail, go back to 2023 and watch consecutive games against Arizona and UCLA. If you want to think that the turnovers that he made against Virginia Tech are representative of the exact same issues that he made previously, look at those 2 games. Because the one big time throw to 8 turnover worthy plays that Cam Ward had in the 2 games against Arizona and UCLA last year is not who he is this year. So there are still some concerns with Cam Ward. There are still, there's always probably going to be a high rate of negative play in his game. When it gets to the NFL level, there's probably going to be a high rate of negative play in his game. But he is really showing signs this year that he can play at a high enough level while limiting those negative plays enough that will make it worthwhile for a team to bet on the upside. And when it comes to this quarterback class, the 2 guys who I think have the highest chance of being the number 1 overall pick, and this might be a class where a quarterback doesn't go number 1. But not talking about just the first quarterback off the board. Talking about the actual number 1 overall pick. A quarterback that is graded highly enough by the NFL to go number 1 overall. The 2 guys on my list right now who I think are the closest to being able to get to that level are Jalen Milroe and Cam Ward. And that is why I'm talking about them first. So now we're into the real wild card of the class and Shedeur Sanders. Shedeur Sanders is in his 4th year, though he is 23 years, 7 months. So that's about a year older than you expect a player to be in his 4th year. So just if you were going, this is a small detail, but if you were going off of biological age, you would probably want to consider Shedeur Sanders more like a 5th year player than a 4th year player. But again, that is a minor note. Shedeur Sanders played the first 2 years of his college career at Jaxson State before transferring to Colorado State, and the most notable thing about that is his dad has been his head coach for all 4 seasons, Deion Sanders. Shedeur Sanders, for all of the controversy, is actually a pretty simple evaluation. It just comes down to what you make of the different parts. Shedeur Sanders does not have the best arm we've ever seen, but he definitely has a good enough arm for the NFL game, and he makes a lot of high difficulty throws just by pure number and ratio. Shedeur Sanders is 3rd this year in total number of big time throws and 11th in big time throw percentage. When I was doing my breakout quarterback listing, a couple people asked me about Shedeur Sanders, and it was mentioned in the post. But Shedeur Sanders simply does not fit into that possible criteria because by that criteria, he has already broken out because by some PFF grading early last year, by big time throws, Shedeur Sanders scores highly in these areas. For a player who scores very highly in big time throws, he also doesn't put the ball in harm's way very often. He is tied for 10th in the total number of turnover-worthy plays with 2. So basically the 9 quarterbacks who qualified for this sample of 110 quarterbacks, only 9 of them had 1 or fewer turnover-worthy plays. Shedeur Sanders has 2, and that's tied for 5th place in percentage. Now, the problem with Shedeur Sanders is there are some worry areas. And there are some off-field things too. We won't talk about that in detail, but there has been some discussion about the way that he has maybe gone after former teammates on social media. There has been some discussion about the way he talks about his own team. While there is some of this that I think is very much tied to the fact that some people don't like certain attitude types, I think for Shedeur Sanders, it is not just attitude type. I do think that there are specific things that you can point to and say that that's probably something that you don't want your quarterback to do or say about teammates or former teammates. But aside from that, we're mostly focused on the on-field negatives for the purposes of this show, especially this far out, and because people are going to make of that what they make of that. And the on-field issues are the fact that out of 110 quarterbacks in this sample, again, I think the minimum number of dropbacks was like 96, because that's how many Drew Allar has. But in this sample of 110 quarterbacks, he was 82nd in time to throw and 83rd in pressure to sack rate. So it's important to note that not all pressures are created equal. Just because one quarterback's pressured a certain amount of time and takes a certain amount of sacks doesn't mean that another quarterback is, worse at it just because of pressure to sack. But it is also worth noting that Shedeur Sanders has always had a high pressure to sack rate regardless of the pressures that has been allowed by his offensive line. We have seen a little bit of improvement in this area this year, but we'll have to continue to see if he can continue to make quick decisions and make decisions against pressure and blitzes that will make sure that he is able to unlock the high upside with low risk taking arm that he has for the next level. So there are still a good number of games on the Colorado schedule. They don't play, obviously, the hardest schedule being in the Big 12 in terms of the defenses that we want to see them against. There are plenty of teams in the Big 12 that are good, and the teams in the Big 12 are as good as Colorado. But he doesn't necessarily play the top tier defenses. But, if they continue to play as well as they are capable of or playing through parts of this season, we could even see Colorado make a run at the playoff, because all they would need to do is get into the Big 12 championship game and win a Big 12 championship game, and then they would be in the playoff. So I don't know what all we will see out of Shedeur Sanders moving forward, but to me, he is, again, more of a simple evaluation. For things that I look for that are positives, he scores very, very highly. But for things that I look for that I hope players avoid, he doesn't actually avoid those. So he's the kind of a tale of two different things. And then he's also about 23.5. So if he was that kind of tale of two different things, but had the big time throws and was a early declare, very young prospect, and kind of the JJ McCarthy mold, that would be a little easier to buy into. But as an older prospect, I think we have to kind of worry if the high time to throw and pressure to sack are part of the profile. And then after Shedeur Sanders, still in this tier 1 to 2B, I have Cade Klubnik, the quarterback from Clemson, who people who listen to the show know I am very high on and rising on rapidly. Cade Klubnik is 6'2", 210 pounds, and would be under 22 years old if he declared this year. Now, there is a chance that he does not declare this year, especially if he cannot get into the place of, say, where JJ McCarthy was last year as a top 12 pick. But that is kind of where I see Cade Klubnik as the potential for being this year's JJ McCarthy, a guy who has taken a lot of steps forward, who looks calm, poised, and checks boxes in a lot of key different areas. And while he might not be perfect or really wow you on a game-to-game basis or in every game, there is enough here for an NFL team to see and want to build on, especially this year for Cade Klubnik when he's adding a few explosive rushing touchdowns. It's important to note that, you contrast it with Shedeur Sanders, right? Shedeur Sanders, we just talked about great big-time throws, great turnover-worthy plays, but a couple areas where he's not doing as strongly. Right now, for Cade Klubnik, he is strong in pretty much any area that I really look for out of a quarterback. Even in the higher difficulty areas, big-time throws, going down the field, Cade Klubnik is going down the field. Cade Klubnik is playing really confident. The one separation between JJ McCarthy and Cade Klubnik, if we were going down this comparison, is that if Cade Klubnik has the kind of JJ McCarthy jump, and if he is in the middle of that, the statistics are going to look way better because they are letting Cade Klubnik chuck it. In this past game, the completion percentage will look pretty bad. It's under 50%, and that's fair. There were a couple drops that could have gotten him over 50%, and it was a fine game. I'm not trying to suggest it was more than a fine game, but it's also important to note that he had a 14 ADOT. He threw it more than 20 yards downfield 7 times, which is a lot for a game, and he did generate 3 big-time throws on those downfield passes. A couple people will point out from watching the game themselves, I saw this a lot around social media, that a lot of people also thought that a couple of the passes he should have been rewarded, not him, but defensive pass interference calls. Obviously, those would save him the incompletions, but regardless of those factors, a couple of those DPIs are coming in because the one thing I noted in the Georgia game as well as the NC State game is he is underthrowing players a little bit, and that is probably why he had the lower completion percentage overall, but he still had a pretty good game. One thing to note is in that pressure to sack area that we keep talking about, Cade Klubnik took 12 pressures and only 1 sack. And this was something, even against Georgia, that he did really, really well. So far in the season, he has taken 33 pressures and he has been sacked only twice. So that's 6.1%. So the Shedeur Sanders number, that's like 22, 23, 24%. So basically, again, not all pressures are created equal. But if we're comparing Shedeur Sanders to Cade Klubnik, Shedeur Sanders is probably getting sacked about 4 times more often on the same pressures. Or again, not the same pressures, but the same number of pressures statistically. And so when you look at the big time throw growth, when you look at the ability to avoid sacks, when you look at the fact that he is still a very young quarterback and making this huge, confident, poised progression from year 2 to year 3, these are the things that more than anybody in this class, align with a prototypical breakout for a young quarterback. I think Cam Ward kind of has a bit of a prototypical senior quarterback breakout, but I don't think that prototypical and senior quarterback breakout really belong in the same sentence. We do have a fair amount of senior quarterbacks getting drafted fairly highly, but it still is pretty clear when you look at the recent history of especially very highly drafted players that early declares are still preferred. And so Cade Klubnik might not be playing at maybe the level that Cam Ward is, Shedeur Sanders is, or Jalen Milroe is right now, but I think he's playing at an increased level from last year that should be highlighted, and I think he deserves to be in this category. Because of my opinion on Cade Klubnik, I recently set out to trade for Cade Klubnik in my only Devy, and I successfully traded for Cade Klubnik. So now we're going to see if this is right, because I am trying to buy in before this breakout. So Cade Klubnik, it is important to note that I saw a bet online. I just wanted to see what his first overall pick odds were because you can't see first round odds. And his first overall pick odds were something like plus 25,000, which would be an insane payout. But the reason I wouldn't put even $1 on that insane payout is that I don't think he has the tools to go number 1 overall. And I don't even know if Shedeur does. But Cam Ward and Jalen Milroe, different kinds of tools, but in my opinion, they both have the tools, the playmaking ability that could potentially at least go number 1 overall. Cade Klubnik, I don't know if he has that, but I do think Cade Klubnik can be a top 20 pick at the NFL level, and maybe I'm wrong and he can go higher if he continues his progression, because I mentioned the explosive rushing touchdowns, and he does have a 30 and I believe 50-yard rushing touchdown carry in each of the last 2 games. And so Cade Klubnik is showing things that do relate to a little bit more upside. So Cade Klubnik is the guy that this show is going to be higher on than most other shows. And we'll see how that works out. Right now, Cade Klubnik to me is this year's J.J. McCarthy. We're getting there a little early. This is one of those things that I would love to hear like a Dane Brugler prospect to pro segment on it, but I haven't found a replaceable kind of show that is that consistent and sharp yet. But right now, I have Cade Klubnik as the quarterback of this true sophomore class that is actually making the leap that we were hoping for out of these guys like Allar and Wigman. So Cade Klubnik in my tier 1 to B, and then my final player in this B tier is Jaxson Dart. 6'2", 225 in his 4th year, though for a 4th year player, he is fairly young, 22 years, 4 months. That would actually make him younger than some senior quarterbacks end up being, and he played as a freshman at USC. He is now a 3-year starter at Ole Miss, and he is one of the best quarterbacks statistically right now in the country. 91 of 119, 1,397 passing yards, 8 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 76.5% completion, and 11.7 yards per attempt. The main reason that Jaxson Dart is in this tier specifically is that Jaxson Dart is a really good quarterback rusher. He might not be Jalen Milroe, but he probably goes beyond being a scrambler. In his Ole Miss career, he ran for 699 yards, 568 yards, and so far this year, he's up over 156. So these aren't numbers that will blow you away, but in a 13-game season, averaging out about 600 yards every 13 games is pretty solid. But my issues for Jaxson Dart are that so far in the season, he has played mostly weaker competition, and so much of what Jaxson Dart seems to do with the Ole Miss offense, I would consider kind of like backyard kind of football. I don't mean that to be kind of super derogatory, which is probably what it sounds like, but more than any other quarterback, when I watch him, Jaxson Dart throws things that are very wide open, and if not, kind of just holds the ball and scrambles around. You know, a couple shows ago, we went over this quarterback breakout criteria, and I mentioned Dart as a breakout, and I've gone back and forth on it, because one thing I should always note on this show is that I talk about a lot of these potentially objective principles, and, you know, that can have solid lines, like, say, you know, you need to have over a 90 PFF passing grade, and this number of big-time throws. But I only relay it that way because you kind of have to find specific points to kind of explain it to other people. But for me, it's more of just a kind of estimation based on early season performance and seeing if this early season performance is aligning with things that we've seen in the past that are indicative of breakouts. And I've really gone back and forth with Jaxson Dart because on paper with Jaxson Dart, if you ignore the competition differences, he is clearly hitting all of the thresholds that we discussed for a breakout quarterback a few shows ago. But I am pretty concerned about the fact that against non-power conference opponents, Jaxson Dart has 9 big-time throws and 1 turnover-worthy play. That's phenomenal. But against power conference opponents, and his power conference opponents have only been Wake and Kentucky, so Kentucky in particular is a pretty good team this year, but Wake just lost to Louisiana Lafayette. And against these two teams, Jaxson Dart has 2 big-time throws and 2 turnover-worthy plays. So 1-to-1 ratio and 1 big-time throw a game. Those numbers aren't going to cut it. So I do have Jaxson Dart in this tier because specifically for the rushing. If Jaxson Dart didn't have this rushing ability, because I do have some significant concerns about him, he might be a tier 3 quarterback. And the way these tiers are broken up kind of stylistically, Jaxson Dart might be overranked if you just called him 5. Jaxson Dart might be the one guy that I wouldn't be willing to give up like a Garrett Nussmeier or a Carson Beck or a Quinn Ewers, who might be more likely to get drafted highly to kind of try to sniff out the upside. When it comes to Jaxson Dart, when it comes to the fact that he has a very high PFF grade, a very high number of big-time throws overall, so he scores highly overall in areas that I generally look for. And so when you look at that, combined with the fact that I'm not completely sold on him, Jaxson Dart is probably a sell for me in Devy leagues. I do have him in a Devy league, and it's kind of hard to sell players like this, but he's probably going to kind of be slipped in some way into an on-the-board conversation soon, and I'm probably going to hope and see if I can get something close to top 5 quarterback value in this class for Jaxson Dart. But again, just not to end on the negative side of things, because there are a lot of positives with Jaxson Dart. He can make a lot of the throws. He does seem to have a good live arm, and he is very mobile. So from a tools perspective, there's a lot of check boxes, and a lot of the things he is asked to do are restricted because of his offense. But regardless of that, it really is the pressure to sack, because I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but his pressure to sack isn't great either. It's the sitting in the pocket until either someone is wide open, or he gets sacked, or he scrambles for a first down. Those kind of like 3 true outcomes issues that really kind of concern me. We'll get to Quinn Ewers actually pretty much now, but Quinn Ewers has a system that concerns me. But even in this system with Quinn Ewers, there are a lot more things that I think are translatable to the next level, and that he's doing at a high level that translates to the next level. When it comes to getting the ball out quickly, when it comes to being very, very accurate within that short range game at a very high volume in that short range game. But for Jaxson Dart, very few things actually seem like they would translate to the next level from the offense. So you're really grading him purely on the arm and the mobility alone, and the instinct to make close decision throws and to make tight window throws. That kind of concerns me a little bit compared to just taking the big open plays. So I mentioned Quinn Ewers, mentioned the system a little bit, and the system is one of the main reasons he's here, but there's a couple of like more objective things that I want to get through first with Quinn Ewers, starting with just what his upside is for fantasy. Though I guess that might not be purely objective, but some of it is on the paper itself. And so what I mean by that is Quinn Ewers has this perspective, and we are in the C tier now, the kind of the more boring tier. And I'm sorry for people who really like Quinn Ewers, but I'm going to explain what I mean by this. But Quinn Ewers has this 5-star, 100 out of 100 prospect grade reputation that I think people associate with him having a lot of upside. And his arm is fantastic, but an arm alone doesn't necessarily give you upside in the fantasy game, or like those aren't the things that we look for upside. The ability of the arm, it is more things that, especially just the raw ability of the arm. Now, if Quinn Ewers was making a ton of down the field, high difficulty throws, that would be another thing entirely. But right now, even the arm itself is kind of projection. But outside of the arm, I think some people equate some kind of upside. But Quinn Ewers is listed at 6'2", 210 pounds, and there were broadcasts early in the season last year that remarked on how he got down to 195. So Quinn Ewers is somewhere between below average to probably worse than below average when it comes to quarterback size. He is big enough to play at the NFL level. He's not Bryce Young, but his frame is by far the worst on this list, outside of maybe Miller Moss. Almost every player on this list is much better built through their frame than Quinn Ewers. Quinn Ewers sacrificed some of that for mobility, but his mobility has ultimately led to him being able to scramble a little bit, but it's not like he's a rusher, and he's not even that much of a scrambler. He is closer to a pocket passer than even a scrambler, I would say. And then on top of that, you have to add in at this point that the injuries are going to be a significant concern. I know what I'm about to say is going to strike people as wild and crazy, or at least some people, but these injuries are probably going to be considered more concerning than injuries for someone like Michael Penix Jr., because Michael Penix Jr. had 4 injuries that you could at least argue were freak injuries, and then he had 2 fully healthy seasons. So he gets to sit around and say, listen, I know I've had all these injuries before, but I've been healthy for a really long time. Maybe I've been banged up, but I've played through it, and that's what we need to do. Quinn Ewers is going to have 0 fully healthy seasons if he comes into the NFL at this point. He did not play as a freshman. In his first career game, he got knocked out of his first career game against Alabama as a true sophomore and ended up missing the next 3 games. So he missed 3.5 games in his first year. And then in his second year starting, meaning his third year overall, his junior year, he missed 2 more games last year. And then so far this year, he's missed half a game against UTSA and then 2 more games starting, including the first game of SEC play. Now, we can say they're being conservative, we can say they're holding him back, but there's a reason you need to be conservative. If he was 100% healthy, you wouldn't be conservative. They're being conservative for a reason. They're being conservative because he's not 100% healthy. I heard a 70% thrown out at one point this week, and it's like, okay, well, if your quarterback's 70% healthy, that's kind of an issue. And so I actually think Quinn Ewers' injuries problems are going to be worse than Penix, because Quinn Ewers is going to go into the NFL draft as a guy who has never stayed healthy and has a frame that is creating a correlation, creating a reason that he's not staying healthy. So I think the injury concerns are real. I think the frame being below average is real. I think the non-mobility is real. I think the fact that his arm is great is also real. But I think the arm being great only gets you so far when we're at an NFL stage for prospect evaluation. And that's before we get even into the fantasy side of things, where those rushing things are so much more important for ceiling. So for fantasy, I see Quinn Ewers as more of a lower ceiling prospect. And then on top of that, Quinn Ewers is still struggling once more with the high difficulty areas, and they're just not trying it anymore. His average depth of target this year is down to 6.2. So let's create a contrast with Arch Manning, right? We've already done this on one show, and to be very clear, the point is not to say Arch Manning is better than Quinn Ewers, though he is a better quarterback prospect than Quinn Ewers. But I've had at least one segment on this show. I've talked about this online a little bit, and every time you have this conversation, people get really upset, especially Texas fans seem to get really upset about the fact that you're kind of being derogatory towards Quinn, because Quinn's been around for so much longer. Sarkisian says he runs the system so much better. And all those things are very, very much true. Like, when the system is running well, you want Quinn to be the quarterback. When Sarkisian is coaching well against the defensive coordinator, you want Quinn to be the quarterback, because Quinn makes all the decisions at this point quicker, faster, better, and with avoiding sacks in particular, a little bit better than Arch Manning. But my points with Arch Manning are, look at how much different this offense is in what they even try to accomplish. Arch Manning has more big time throws and a higher big time throw percentage than Quinn Ewers on the season. But more importantly, and the thing that sticks out far more, is that we just mentioned Quinn Ewers' ADOT, 6.2. Arch Manning's ADOT on the season is 10.9, 4.7. Like, that is almost 100%. It's probably 80% higher. So it clearly is not the offense. It clearly is not the weapons. It clearly is not the people around Quinn Ewers that is bringing the ADOT down. It is clearly Steve Sarkisian saying, you're not as good at this, so we're not going to do it as often. And when you are already limited by your mobility, when you are already limited by the fact that you are not physically one of the best prospects that we have, and when you're already limited by the fact that you might even have an injury concern on top of that, you really need to unlock your passing ability down the field, and we do not see that out of Quinn Ewers. So that is why Quinn Ewers is in the C tier, and frankly, I don't know if Quinn Ewers is the one that I would take first out of the C tier. He probably isn't, because if I'm taking players at this level, I'm going for projectable traits. And while Quinn Ewers has the best arm, right now I can't project high upside into that arm because I've never seen it realized. And on the other side of things, I can bank into the fact that Carson Beck and Garrett Nussmeier, the other two players in this tier, have prototypical size and build. Carson Beck a little bit taller than Garrett Nussmeier. Garrett Nussmeier maybe not the tallest quarterback, but he is very thick. So Quinn Ewers, I think a lot of credit needs to be given to Steve Sarkisian. And I don't mean that to be a backhanded thing for Quinn Ewers. That is what it is. I'm not denying it, but I just think a lot of credit needs to be given to Steve Sarkisian. You know, the Clemson offense, let's just make a comparison real quick. The Clemson offense was a little bit better against Stanford. But one thing that really stuck out for me when I've been deep diving into Klubnik and deep diving into Ewers, as say just two of these quarterbacks that I've been going into these past couple weeks, is that there are a lot of plays where Cade Klubnik throws it behind the line of scrimmage to his left or to his right, and the guy just runs into another player's back and falls down for 1 yard. And there are a ton of plays when watching Quinn Ewers where there is so much motion and there is so much movement of the pocket and there is so much, moving right, throwing back left. There is so much play design involved, and these plays go for 7, 8, 9 yards and occasionally break an explosive. And you just have to give credit to what that offense does. Quinn Ewers has incredible yards per attempt in short passes and passes behind the line of scrimmage. And as much as he deserves some credit for how he creates those short and behind the line of scrimmage passes, those are the passes that, more than the passes downfield, I credit to the playmakers and the play callers. So when he's excelling in the playmakers and play callers areas and not necessarily in the areas that he personally adds to the game with big time throws, with mobility plays, that is why, for me, Quinn Ewers is not a top 5 quarterback in this class, even if you make the adjustment for the ABC tier. He's not in the A or B tier. He's not a high upside, exciting quarterback for me. And so maybe this ends up aging very poorly and he ends up being the first one drafted. And because of how open season this class is, I do think he can be the first one drafted. But right now, he is towards the bottom of the 1 to 2 tier in how I would value these players right now for fantasy football. So next up, we have the Carson Beck conversation, and I'm phrasing it that way a little bit differently than I would have expected to do before the game on Saturday, but obviously everybody saw Carson Beck, especially in that first half of the game, play terribly against Alabama and cause this huge deficit that, to be fair, he eventually caught Georgia back up, but they ultimately lost the game. But anyway, Carson Beck is a big storyline because, as I mentioned earlier on the show, he is probably now going to slingshot from being the most overrated quarterback in this class to being the most underrated quarterback in this class. And again, for my own personal record, I don't want it to sound like I'm talking outside of both sides of my mouth, but both things can be true. You can have somebody as your quarterback 1 going into a season and then say, whoa, not like that, not like that. But it's important to note that from the very beginning of the game, I was noticing a few things that made me say, the reason I use PFF grading in these things isn't necessarily because I trust the PFF grades or I love the PFF grades. Is because at least a decent number of times when I have observations and then check after the fact, PFF does corroborate what I see at least a decent bit. And this was one of those games, especially by the end of it, where I was saying to myself, I bet the grading in this game is a little bit better than people think. Like, I'm not saying it's going to be a good game. It's definitely not going to be a great game, but it just might not be terrible. And Carson Beck did have 4 turnover-worthy plays, and that's a big number of turnover-worthy plays. Like, we can't look past that at all, especially for a quarterback that, like Quinn Ewers in this C tier, doesn't have the most upside. Like when Cam Ward can help to offset some of the negative playmaking a little bit more. But I will say that Beck did have 4 big-time throws as well, which was something that we were looking for him to do more and more. In this tier, it is the best big-time throw game that we've had out of this tier of quarterbacks. There was one play down the sideline early in the game that really should have been caught, that Beck really put in a perfect spot for his receiver, and I was immediately thinking, that's a big-time throw, and that one's going to cost. Now, he played terribly outside of that, and even in the last drive of the game, he had an opportunity to win the game, and he threw another interception. So we can't glance past these things and pretend that Beck is still really close to being the quarterback 1 when he just got blown away by Jalen Milroe. But he is still somebody who has a lot of NFL traits, and in a quarterback class that has a lot of limitations, and in a quarterback marketplace where the quarterback play around the league is pretty bad right now, a team might take a shot still on a player like Beck fairly early who could quickly become their starting quarterback, just from the perspective that they might think that he can be like their Baker Mayfield, obviously different physical types there, but be like their Baker Mayfield only on a rookie contract. So I don't really have too much to add with Beck. I will just say Beck had a 90 PFF passing grade for the entire season last year. I always like to go to that one because it is hard to do with a good number of mistakes. He probably can't have a 90 PFF passing grade this season, not just because of the Alabama game, but because he hasn't really been doing great up to this point. But he is still capable of putting a season together that, with his first season and with a full body of work, gets him drafted, if not in the first round, in the early second round potentially. And so that's just something to keep in mind with Carson Beck. Particularly if you're in a Devy league and someone is completely hitting the panic button, that might be a price point that I'm willing to swoop in and buy. And it's important to note that, again, these wide receivers are very unreliable, and there's big opponents to come for Georgia. Georgia is one of these teams that they're not going to miss out on big games for the rest of the season. So Carson Beck will have opportunities to build his stock back up. So I probably should have mentioned this player first in C tier, though to be fair, it makes sense to get through Quinn Ewers because Quinn Ewers is such a big name. But I mentioned with Cade Klubnik how there are certain people who either do shows or used to do shows that I really want to hear their opinion on Cade Klubnik. And the other quarterback that I feel relatively higher on than the market at this point that I would like to hear those same opinions on is Garrett Nussmeier, the 6'2", 200-pound quarterback, 23 years, 7 months old. He's a 4th-year player, so a pretty old quarterback there for being a 4th-year player as well. We said that about Shedeur Sanders, and it's equally the same with Garrett Nussmeier. These are both quarterbacks who are more aligned with being a 5th-year quarterback by their age, but they are technically still 4th-year quarterbacks. So if Garrett Nussmeier could just kind of cut out some of the turnover-worthy plays, I think Garrett Nussmeier would be even more of a rising star in this class. Garrett Nussmeier is this quarterback right now who there's a lot of things that will go really well during a game, and then blam, he'll throw it to somebody else. Throw it to the other team, I mean. And obviously we see that a little bit with certain kinds of quarterbacks, but this is Garrett Nussmeier's first year starting, so you give him a little bit of leeway there. But it is just hard to, kind of make him a rising star outside of that category. So if you're looking at the surface stats, I don't know how many of them fully stick out, but a couple of the numbers that from the advanced perspective do for me is out of this tier in general, he has been the best on the season with big time throws. Now he didn't, and this is going to sound ironic to, the idea that that Carson Beck had a horrific game against Alabama, but he hasn't had a game as good as Carson Beck's game in terms of big time throws. But in terms of this season, he's been very good in that category. But what has impressed me even more about Garrett Nussmeier is his ability to completely avoid sacks. Now, the number itself is kind of hard to make too much of because with only 1 sack, once he takes a second one, the number is going to double. But Garrett Nussmeier has taken only 1 sack in 36 pressures. That is 2.8%. He's also getting the ball out in one of the quickest times to throws in the FBS. It did go up a bit this week, but it is 22nd out of 110 quarterbacks in time to throw. And then while he is making too many turnover-worthy play mistakes, it's not like he has a huge number. It's just too high. So when you consider that the turnovers aren't too bad, the big time throws are kind of encouraging, and the avoiding of sacks in other areas are extremely encouraging, those are reasons right away to look into Garrett Nussmeier. And then when I watched, I think the first game I watched was the South Carolina game, which is actually his lowest graded game. And I walked away from that game thinking like there were so many plays in that game that I looked at and said, that guy is an NFL quarterback. And it wasn't anything complicated. It wasn't anything extreme, but it was a guy, he took a lot of hits in that game. For a guy who has 1 sack, he has taken a decent number of quarterback hits. And he took a lot of hits in that game. He delivered the ball over the middle. He delivered what looked to me to be some of the NFL layered throws that we look for in these concepts for these prospects. And so I like to get some confirmation from these very technical aspects, as I don't have any formal training of my own. But to me, a lot of the things that we say about specifically Carson Beck align a ton with Garrett Nussmeier. The things I hear the most about Carson Beck are how he moves well in the pocket, has great footwork, and makes some good plays downfield that are some of the best layered throws of the class. I see a lot of the same concepts on film with Garrett Nussmeier. I see a lot of the same pocket mobility, a lot of the same sack evasion in Garrett Nussmeier, and a lot of the same ability to play tough under pressure. So it might be a little bit too early to know which one I'm going to rank higher ultimately, but it does feel like I'm almost getting, and this is something I would have said before the Alabama game, to be clear. I don't want to make it sound like I'm going back and forth on that, but this is something that I might have said before the Alabama game. It feels like Garrett Nussmeier has a lot of the same pros as Carson Beck, but he is playing better right now. And so if I'm comparing between two prospects where they are kind of similar archetypes and one hasn't really set themselves apart, Carson Beck had a good 2023, but it was nowhere near a spectacular season. I might lean to the one who is currently playing better football, even if, again, Nussmeier has too many mistakes in his play. So you kind of hope that Nussmeier weeds those out as he continues to play more football. Yes, he is over 23 and a half years old when he will be drafted, but again, this is his first year starting at this level. Carson Beck was kind of a similar situation last year, but Carson Beck was relatively young for being a fourth-year player last year, to whereas Garrett Nussmeier is relatively old, so there's a couple of slight differences there that don't actually play into Nussmeier's favor. So now we're on to the tier 3 of quarterbacks, and the tier 3 of quarterbacks are just basically the ones that I don't think are close really to the trajectory of being drafted very highly this year. So we'll start with the one that has a chance to be controversial, just right on that note, with Drew Allar, who's 6'5", 235, has, again, potential to be an early declare this year, 21 years, 6 months. And Drew Allar is one of those quarterbacks to me where, to be fair, his overall season numbers are pretty good in this respect. But I'm listening to the broadcast of the Penn State-Illinois game, and they keep saying, well, Drew Allar might not be doing this, or that, but he's being very efficient. And I really hate that word when we're using it to basically mean only completion percentage, because to me, efficient, a better way to look at efficiency would be to take the amount of passing attempts you have and look at how many yards you have. Because ultimately, completing passes is not any kind of specific goal for a football game, in the sense that the completion itself doesn't get you anything. If the completion is 20 yards downfield, being 20 yards downfield gets you something, but the completion itself does not. And so I guess my point in that is just that when someone goes for 15 for 21 and completes 71% of their passes, but they only have 6 yards an attempt, that to me isn't an efficient performance. Now, in this respect, Drew Allar has been efficient throughout the year, but he has not actually been doing it in ways that translate in high difficulty throws. Drew Allar has played, I believe, 4 games at this point, and he has 3 big-time throws. So he has fewer big-time throws than the amount of games he plays in. Now, to be fair, the ratio isn't as bad as that would sound because he hasn't had as many attempts. They've been running the ball a lot. But even if you make it into a ratio, which by running the ball a lot, you should have more opportunities to have those big-time throws in a sense from the way that the defense is open for you going downfield. As in, you might not have as many total big-time throws, but your big-time throw percentage might be better in a run-heavy offense. Kind of like how we mentioned Jalen Milroe's last year at the very top of this segment. But Drew Allar is 63rd in big-time throw percentage this year. So that's out of 110 quarterbacks again. So that's a little worse than the halfway point. But again, that's all 110 quarterbacks in college football. We don't want to be better than the average college football quarterback. We want to be elite among college football quarterbacks in areas we care about. Maybe not every individual area, but, as they balance out. The other concern with Drew Allar is that out of 110 qualified quarterbacks, and I mentioned this up front with Jalen Milroe, I don't think I mentioned which quarterback it is, Drew Allar is 109th out of 110 in time to throw. Now, he's nowhere near the Jalen Milroe number of 3.44, but 3.16 time to throw is very long for a quarterback like Drew Allar. And if Drew Allar was taking 3.16, but making big time throws, and we were seeing like a Caleb Williams-y, Aaron Rodgers-y thing happen, that would be one thing. That would be awesome. But instead, we're seeing Drew Allar mostly just hold the ball to either throw to wide open guys or take checkdowns or kind of scramble around a little bit, which isn't really his strong suit. And we're not seeing Drew Allar make consistent, sharp decisions or higher difficulty throws that would align with an NFL prospect. Now, he obviously is an NFL prospect still because of the physicality, because of the arm, because of the general size. This was the number one quarterback for a lot of people in his prospect class. And so don't get me wrong, I wouldn't be giving up on Drew Allar, but to me, Drew Allar is not putting up the tape that I would align with someone who should come into the NFL this year. To me, Drew Allar is putting up the tape of a guy who I would say, you know what, you're showing enough that people shouldn't give up on you. But right now, and a lot can change in a season, but right now, I would say you should target 2026. In 2026, Drew Allar will still be a year younger than quarterbacks like Nussmeier, Sanders, and Ward are this season. In 2026, Drew Allar will be the same age as Jalen Milroe is this season. The only quarterbacks that Drew Allar will be older than next season than they currently are this season, I believe on this list are Cade Klubnik and Jaxson Dart. So outside of Cade Klubnik and Jaxson Dart, Drew Allar next year would be younger than everybody on this list respective to their draft year. So Drew Allar, not super negative, and they have some big games coming up to prove me wrong. UCLA, not really a big one, but after that, USC, Wisconsin, Ohio State, Washington, some very good games, some very good teams, I should say. And to finish this section off, to go back to both Allar's system as well as the systems for both Ewers and Dart, Quinn Ewers, Jaxson Dart, these are guys who are kind of put in a box to an extent by their offensive coordinators in terms of like the systems put around them. But Quinn Ewers and Jaxson Dart have been living in these boxes so long, they could show other people around. Like, they know their boxes. They understand their boxes. Quinn Ewers might make mistakes, and he might make ugly mistakes. Like, watch the interception before he gets injured in the UTSA game. That is one of the ugliest interceptions you will ever see. But for the most part, he plays like a guy who knows and controls everything about his box. He understands what his box is supposed to do at different points in time. Jaxson Dart, a little bit of the same way, though it's a little bit more schoolyard with Jaxson Dart. That's why we talked about that a little bit earlier with the mobility. But as opposed to like these guys who've been living in their boxes for years, Drew Allar feels like a guy who is just kind of still being told where to walk around in his box. Like, you go over there, then you go over there. This time we're not going to ask you to do too much. This defense has a high turnover rate, so we're probably just going to run it a lot today. That's kind of how it feels with Drew Allar. So maybe that's just my inaccurate viewing of the situation. But to me, Drew Allar is the player who is not only in a box, like players like Quinn Ewers and Jaxson Dart, where that box is even a problem for them, but he's in a box and he doesn't really have a command of his offense yet. He doesn't have a command of his situation yet. He does hit some open plays, but for right now, he's kind of just holding the ball, hitting a couple open plays, and mostly handing off to a superior running game. So again, not doom and glooming Drew Allar at all. Just, I think this is a guy like Connor Wigman. I don't even bring up Connor Wigman in this segment because I don't even know if he's starting right now. But like Connor Wigman, if he has a real good shot at the NFL draft, I believe his most likely path is through 2026. And then on that same note, that's kind of the same vibe I have for Miller Moss, the quarterback for USC. 6'2", 205 pounds. Nussmeier, the number I gave out, because it's the number LSU has, is 200. But Nussmeier, I mean, you can say whatever you will about these kind of takeaways, but I'm not worried about Nussmeier's build. I think Miller Moss has a much thinner build. So Miller Moss is in his 4th year, but he is a little bit older, 23 years, 5 months. And like Nussmeier, he is a 4th-year player and a 1-year starter. The difference is I don't think Miller Moss is doing quite as much that translate to the next level, and I don't think that the tools and the traits are quite as high level, even aside from just the general thickness compared to Garrett Nussmeier. So maybe that's just my inaccurate general interpretation here, but based on that idea, when it comes to someone like Miller Moss getting to the first round as a 1-year starter, the season you have to have under those circumstances needs to be almost perfect. While he was almost perfect against LSU, and he deserves a lot of credit for that, Miller Moss has been mediocre in his efficiency the last 2 games against the power conference. In his last 2 games against power conferences, he's 58 of 96. That's 60.4%, 60%, not that great in college. 591, 6.2 yards per attempt, 6.2, again, not that great for Lincoln Riley, and 6 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. So I'm not trying to be really, really harsh on a first-year starter for these numbers and make it seem like, it's 3 games in the season, he can't ascend any higher. But I guess what I would say is it's kind of funny to me because people say, well, it's too soon to make this distinction that he's not going to ascend any higher this year. We've only played a few games. But if a few games is too few to make a distinction, well, how's the NFL going to change their mind when he doesn't have that many games left? I think that's the way you really have to look at it from a sample perspective. I'm not saying that in a small sample of time, the small sample is so important that it means the most for everything else. I'm saying that even if he turns around from the small sample, what we have left is such a small sample itself that the NFL might not be able to buy into it. So Miller Moss has shown some good things. He doesn't have the age arguments I just made for Drew Allar. He would be a very old quarterback if he came back and played 1 more year with Lincoln Riley. But with 1 more year of eligibility, Miller Moss is another one of these players where I'm going to put in the category of, in my personal opinion, I think his more likely path to the NFL is in 2026. And then finally, just 1 more quarterback. It's going to be a short conversation for this one. Noah Fifita, who does have a potential to be an early declare and is a really good performing true sophomore. He's one of the best true junior at this point, I should say. He was one of the best true sophomore performers last year. And with Drew Allar and Cade Klubnik, those are the only 3 players that have the potential to be early declares that I am talking about. And that is what says why this quarterback class is seen as a down one. But the real reason that Noah Fifita is going to be a short conversation is that even though he's doing a lot of the things that I look for a breakout quarterback, the number 1 criteria for my breakout quarterback list was requisite tools. And while Noah Fifita is a very good college quarterback and has a very good arm, we do have to question significantly whether he has requisite physicality for the NFL game. There is no listed weight for Arizona, but Arizona lists his height, which is usually favorable to the player as 5 foot 10 inches. If Fifita is anywhere under 5'10", which is what my normal assumption is for any listed size, is that the player is under their listed size, because that is the right and fair assumption more than 90% of the time. So if that assumption is correct with Fifita, which maybe it's not, maybe they are rounding down for some reason with Fifita, maybe they just said, screw it, this guy's small, let's really lean into it. But taking a general estimation rule that I would use with any prospect, Noah Fifita, I would estimate at under 5'10", at 5'9.5", between 5'9.25" and 5'9.5". So if Noah Fifita is between 5'9.25" and 5'9.5", it is just really, really hard to see him play quarterback at the NFL level. And it's extremely hard to see him get drafted highly in the wake of Bryce Young, especially because you can say, Kyler Murray, but Noah Fifita is not as quick as Kyler Murray. He's not as fast. He's not as dynamic as a rusher. So Kyler Murray is only going to help if you are that kind of a mobile threat. So Fifita, like I said, he is doing some of the breakout things. 2.6% big time throw percentage last year, 5.9% this year. That is a very significant jump that if Noah Fifita, with his prospect grade and with his grading last year, was 6'2", I would take very seriously. But until someone with either from an NFL team or a major scout with major connections says the NFL is going to take this kid seriously, despite the listed size, I'm probably going to have him in tier 3 myself, because it's hard for me, frankly, to take it seriously if he actually is 5'9". So that's all I have for the quarterbacks. I will take a short break and then get into a much shorter segment on the tight end position for 2025. If you listened to my last show where I went over the 2023 and 2024 rankings I did around this time, you might think that the tight ends would be my most confident position because my tight end rankings were frankly really good. But I honestly think I just kind of got lucky there. I will defend some hits in some other categories, but the tight ends were probably just a little bit lucky. And so that's my way of saying that despite history, the tight end position is generally my least confident because it is the hardest to project. It is the hardest because it is so multifaceted and we need teams to have a good idea of specific uses for these players. Because the tight end position, it is kind of the same thing with wide receiver, but even more so with the different kinds of things tight ends do, it just becomes the hardest position to project. So on that note, the reason that my top two tight ends, and I'll kind of cover them maybe at the same time here, are the top two tight ends for me is that when it comes to so many different projectable areas, they score very highly, and they don't seem, at least to me, to have any red flags. So those two tight ends are Colston Loveland of Michigan and Mason Taylor of LSU. Last year, we had a lot of conversation about the size of our tight ends because the top two in fantasy around this point were Brock Bowers and JT Sanders. And even after Ben Sinnott broke out into the combine or major sphere of fantasy knowledge, Ben Sinnott also isn't a very tall tight end. He's like a bigger tight end than those two guys, like physically built, but he's not a tall tight end. I think he's still like a 6'4" tight end. But this season, in this tight end class, I don't think we have a Brock Bowers, to be clear. I don't think being bigger is better than Brock Bowers. I'd rather be Brock Bowers. But we have some big tight ends, at least at the top of this tight end class. Colston Loveland listed at 6'5", 245 pounds. And Mason Taylor listed at 6'5", 255 pounds. So I don't know exactly where these guys line up, but they're both probably going to be right around 6'5". And again, even if we're making a size adjustment for listed size, that's still a very significantly large listed size. So on the Colston Loveland side of things, it's important to note that the numbers just aren't going to be great. In his first game with Alex Orji, he had 4 receptions for 41 yards, and 4 receptions for 41 yards was 40% of the receptions and 47.7% of the receiving yards. So considering in a game where he goes 4 for 41, he can have half of his team's production, we're probably not going to see the overall numbers look very good this year for Colston Loveland. So far in the season, he has 228 yards and 1 touchdown, and ideally he would have 2 touchdowns because with these wacky proportions, that would make it look so much better. But focusing mostly on the yardage because it's a small sample, 228 out of the 545 while he's been in the game has been 41.8%. I did remove the game that he did not play because I always do that for prospects and it felt kind of silly to not do it. But I almost didn't do it just because in the one game he did not play, the team threw for 32 passing yards. So 32 passing yards, even in a situation like this, barely affects the proportions. But anyway, his receiving proportion, 41.8%. His touchdown proportion, only 20%, 1 of 5. You'd hope it was 2 of 5, but whatever. It's a small sample. But I think mostly when it comes to the big time performances, people are going to roll back the tape 2022 and really focus on some of those big games because lucky for Colston Loveland, he did have some fairly big games with J.J. McCarthy, being J.J. McCarthy's number 1 at least at times in those games. So if you're asking which games to look for, 4 for 79 and 2 touchdowns against Michigan State, and then the big ones. 5 for 88 against Ohio State, 3 for 64 in the national championship against Washington. These are some of the games that Colston Loveland shown out for. Obviously these aren't giant games, but they are enough probably to put the kind of film that you need to put on film as a tight end up for Colston Loveland. That is why he is the tight end that most commonly gets mocked in the first round. Though right now, I do have a pretty similar grade on Mason Taylor of LSU. Both these players, by the way, very young. I didn't find Mason Taylor's date of birth from the same one that I find most of these sources, but if Mason Taylor and Colston Loveland's date of births are accurate on my lists, these will be 2 of the younger players that I've ever really evaluated, and especially at the tight end position where a lot of guys lean a little older and they're more common seniors. Both Colston Loveland and Mason Taylor are currently 20 years old, to just put put it that way, right? And I think that is at least accurate, that they are both currently 20, which means at some point between now and the start of next year, they will probably turn 21. But Mason Taylor is improving as a pass catcher this year. As much as there are some numbers that suggest that Kyron Lacy has been pretty solid, and he has been, we'll get to him much later, either today or tomorrow or Thursday. But really, when it comes to the reliable pass catcher that has taken on some roles left behind by Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. to help out the quarterbacks of LSU, the most reliable one has been Mason Taylor. Mason Taylor seems to be more involved, and he seems to be most involved in the bigger games. The games that he seems to get phased out in are the games against the lower competition levels where LSU is winning handedly. So when you consider that when the game gets tight, that's when Mason Taylor is getting targeted more. Maybe that makes him, kind of a check down option. Regardless, as a big tight end, that could go a long way. Now, I've talked about this at least on one show before, I believe, at this point, but Mason Taylor has this weird statistical anomaly, I would almost call it, where he is just not targeted very often throughout his entire career in contested catch situations. He has excelled in the few contested catch situations he has had, so I don't want to make it sound like I don't think he can do it. But it is just a fair notation to make because, again, it is just such a weird low number. It seems like he's almost never targeted in these situations. So Mason Taylor, Colston, Loveland, they are at the top because they check so many boxes. They are big, they play in major conferences, they have been productive throughout their careers. Even as a freshman for Mason Taylor and a sophomore for Colston Loveland, these guys, very young ages, were producing in major conferences. Now, this next guy is the best producer of the bunch, frankly, but he doesn't check all the boxes. So we'll get into that with Harold Fannin Jr. So I haven't been able to find Harold Fannin Jr.'s age. I have been able to find his date of birth, but I don't know what year he was born in. So he's either going to be 21 years and 1 month, which would be very young and as a rookie, or he will be 22 years, 1 month, which is still fairly young for a rookie, especially a rookie tight end. But the big question mark with Fannin is going to be the size. Now, before we get into that, let's just talk about what he's done this year. In his last 3 games, Harold Fannin Jr., a tight end, has 11 receptions for 137 yards and a touchdown, 8 receptions, 145 yards and a touchdown, and 12 receptions, 188 yards and 2 touchdowns. So all combined, he has 31 receptions, 470 yards, and 4 touchdowns. That is, again, in 3 games, and in 2 of those 3 games, he played Penn State and Texas A&M, 2 programs that are far, far better than his own Bowling Green. In the last 8 games, Harold Fannin Jr. has 58 receptions, 892 yards, and 8 touchdowns. So this is an 8-game stretch where he is averaging over 100 yards and a touchdown per game. The big question, though, is that Harold Fannin Jr. borderline does not even look like a tight end. Harold Fannin Jr. is listed at 6'4", 230 pounds. So to put this kind of into perspective, because we don't know how the differences are going to be between listed sizes and, comparing a Georgia listed size to a Bowling Green listed size, there's probably a flaw in that as well. But Brock Bowers had a lot of conversations about how he was too small or if people would think he was too small. And Brock Bowers is listed at 6'4", 240. Harold Fannin Jr. has the same listed size, only 10 pounds lighter. And when you look at Harold Fannin Jr., if you watch him and if you've never played him before, your first reaction probably will be like, oh, that's not what I really expected when I heard I'm about to watch a tight end. So the production is fantastic, and he might be just the level of football player that we need to pay attention to. And frankly, I don't know what his positional designation will be at the next level. It probably will be moved tight end, but when he lines up next to a tackle, it does not look like a tight end. So Harold Fannin Jr., the production is there. The level in terms of the production doesn't really bother you too much because, again, he did it against A&M and Penn State. But the level also does have to bother you a little bit because we don't consistently get tape of seeing him at this size play high-level teams. And it just is hard to know how this is going to translate at the next level. So Harold Fannin Jr., I have translation questions that I don't have in the other 2. But when it comes to the fantasy game in particular, if he is drafted highly, with what he has shown from production, you would have to think that he should be seen as a tight end with immense upside. So maybe the right way to put it is that Harold Fannin Jr. has as much upside, maybe more upside, than any tight end in this class, but he is also probably far more likely than Loveland or Taylor to just not see the field because of being an awkward fit for the game, especially if he can't be an immediate dynamic receiver at the NFL level. And then finally, Tyler Warren is a tight end from Penn State who has gotten a lot of credit so far this year. He's in a lot of lists. He's on Dane Brugler's top 5 list, which again, I've already given credit because I believe Dane Brugler brings up probably the sharpest lists in the major media market for this time of year. But I think right away it is important to note that we just talked about Harold Fannin Jr. having a huge game against Penn State. Tyler Warren had a huge game in that game too, but a Penn State player having a huge game against Bowling Green is not the same thing as a Bowling Green player having a huge game against Penn State. Right now, I think these guys are in the same tier, and that's kind of just because of the Harold Fannin Jr. low floor argument, but I would lean to Fannin a decent bit if I had to pick. I think my main reason for that is because Tyler Warren has the awkward situation, and I don't want to speak too negatively on him, but Tyler Warren has this awkward situation where he is the least productive tight end of the 3 tight ends of this list. He's also the oldest by 2 full years, 2 full seasons. So, Tyler Warren has played, realistically twice as many seasons as everybody else. Everybody else has finished 2, he's finished 4, but Tyler Warren has less numbers. That said, they have been using him as the wildcat quarterback for this team. He is explosive athletically, he shows some ability as a ball carrier, and he checks a lot of boxes physically. He might not check all of the boxes prototypically like Colston, Loveland, and Mason Taylor do, but unlike Harold Fannin Jr., you look at him and you say, okay, that is a tight end. That's an NFL tight end. That's what they're supposed to look like. That's what they're supposed to do. That's what they're supposed to have versatility. Tyler Warren brings that versatility to the table. And so that is why he is, in this case, my tight end 4. Now, tight end, again, low confidence level position, and we're probably only drafting 1 or 2 in the first 2 rounds. So my tight end 4 is a player who probably isn't even drafted in the top 3 rounds or maybe at the end of the 3 rounds. Again, depending on what the draft capital looks like. So not a huge thing to say either way about Tyler Warren, but he is the guy I have chosen as my tight end 4. I did 4 the last 2 years. I didn't just do it for that reason, but I felt he was the one that fit the most. With that said, I do have a couple of honorable mention tight ends written down here. I have Elijah Arroyo from Miami of Florida. Arroyo had a lot of hype going into last year, but missed most of the season due to injury. And Arroyo is one of these players where, I don't know who it is, but someone out there really wants to sell you on the idea of Elijah Arroyo, right? I was watching a game with Elijah Arroyo with a Miami game, and he had a reception, and they were like, he now has his highest career receiving yards and receptions. And they were trying to make it sound like he was a breaking out player. And it's well, he has his highest receiving yards and receptions because those numbers were really low coming into the season. It's not because he's done a ton already this season. And then right after the fact, the main commentator on the broadcast says, and that's why NFL teams are really looking at this guy as a 1st round pick. And so, with the physicality and with tight end being such a physical position, maybe that ends up being true. From my perspective, a 4th-year player who doesn't have a ton of production and is a little bit of a move catching tight end is not someone that I think is on a trajectory for the 1st round. But I think when I hear those narratives, that says to me that there are some people out there at least that see him as a high trait individual, and that maybe if he does well, that will pick up steam and be worth listening to. Bryson Nesbitt of North Carolina was one of my top 3 tight ends going into the season last year, I believe, maybe 4, but I think top 3. But he is a move tight end, plays out of the slot, has very good size, and is producing at least a little bit for North Carolina. So I don't want to completely forget about someone I used to be pretty high on. And then Jake Brimingstool, the tight end from Clemson. I haven't seen or watched him play too much, but I have seen a lot in these games with Cade Klubnik. And I've also seen him ranked highly in some of the professional lists. So I haven't seen enough, either physically or from the production, to rank him where I would need to put him in the top 4. I would value the versatility that I've seen from Tyler Warren so far, a little bit over Brimingstool, but a name that I think deserves to be in this minor honorable mention tier. That is all I have for this video today. I called this a video clip at the beginning. I think obviously that was probably not the right word. It was probably more right to say it was a segment from the Fantasy for Real podcast, episode 51, which then goes into my running back rankings. I do plan on releasing these running back rankings on this channel in a couple of days, but if you want to hear them right now, you can always go to my Substack at cjfreel.substack.com, follow the podcast at Fantasy for Real on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and you can also follow the show on X or Twitter at FFB4Real, that's FFBFORREAL. Thank you, and again, apologies for anyone who followed this channel when it went dormant. I will try to at least start posting again semi-regularly, including these rankings and a few other tidbits and segments from the Fantasy for Real podcast. But with that said, I got nothing else today, so goodbye.